During his recent speech on the budget, our leader quoted from Ecclesiastes, quote, "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun," end quote. When it comes to this particular government, that quote hits hard. Canadians are learning there's nothing new under the sun of Pierre Trudeau. Just like his father, he swept to power with a mania that seemed to capture the spirit of the times. Within 4 years, that spirit was dead, and disillusioned Canadians returned a minority government. Like father, like son, both cut expensive deals with the NDP. Both of them repudiated the fiscal policies of their Liberal predecessors. If someone told me when I was first elected that I'd feel pity for the legacy of Paul Martin, I'd have suggested they seek professional help. Yet here we stand in the wreckage and ruins of Canada's consensus that budgets should be balanced. After 8 years of Pierre Trudeau, Canadians found themselves living with stagflation. After 16 years of Pierre Trudeau, Canada was on the brink of bankruptcy. Pierre Trudeau was in power for 16 years, and it took another 16 years just to get back to balance. After 8 years of this Prime Minister, the situation might have even been worse than it was in 1984. As much as this Prime Minister would like to live in a fantasy world where budgets balance themselves, Conservatives believe in reality-based policy. The hard truth some Canadians will need to relearn is that progressive socialism always fails everywhere it's tried because eventually they run out of other people's money. Unfortunately, progressive socialists never admit they're economically illiterate and historically blind. When they've taxed away all your income, they'll come for your savings next. When progressive socialists turn government into a gravy train, we should not be surprised that groups of people begin to fight for the best seats on board. But it doesn't have to be this way. And it's not too late for this government to change course. That's why Conservatives are calling on the government to come back with a plan to balance the budget.
Good to know.
Sorry for mispronouncing the title.
Who grew up in the 70s and 80s remember a disastrous Trudeau economic legacy that most definitely was not worth the cost. 14 deficits in 15 years, leading to an inflation crisis, an energy crisis, and a housing crisis. The long-term impact of interest payments on that Trudeau debt forced another Liberal government a decade later to cut a devastating 32% from transfers for healthcare, education, and social services. This Liberal NDP government is going down the exact same road. How much will they spend on interest on their record debt this year?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
We constantly talk about the record of fiscal responsibility, Mr. Speaker. During the Stephen Harper years, they ran 7 consecutive deficits.
Wow.
Deficits, Mr. Speaker. Under this government, we've seen economic growth. We've seen this government go through an extremely challenging time in the pandemic. But guess what? Businesses are still there. They are finding ways to thrive as a result of the ways that we supported them and continue to find ways to support them. When Canadians need support for key other challenges now, like housing, we are there. They're putting half measures on the table. They're not worth the risk, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Well, Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of mind-blowing, unprecedented, previously unfathomable increases in spending, this government's response to every question is to ask why we won't help them spend even more. Again and again and again, we on this side will stand up against an incompetent Liberal government that is leading us down a path of economic devastation. Again, my question was reasonable and straightforward, and I'd appreciate an answer this time. What will this Liberal NDP government spend on interest on its record debt this year?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Turn it into surplus, they turn it into deficit after deficit after deficit, Mr. Speaker. On this side, we put constructive measures on the table, like lifting GST on the building of rentals for Canadians. They talk about an attachment that they have to a vision for the country that puts the middle class front and center. It's not true, Mr. Speaker. Why are they proposing at this time, at a time where Canadians are facing a housing crisis, to tax the building of rentals for the middle class? It makes no sense. A reckless approach from start to finish.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's interesting the finance critic for the Conservative Reform Party says that they're going to cut the infrastructure bank. And he's just reaffirming a policy that we know. But my question for him is that, is the member aware of the many projects that are taking place in his home province? One of the examples would be the investments in irrigation, which is helping farmers diversify. And I know, Liberals have continuously been there to advocate for farmers, and the farmers would actually be fairly disappointed in the Conservatives not recognizing the importance of irrigation in the province of Manitoba. Why does the Conservative Party oppose that particular program?
The Honourable Member for Calgary Forest Lawn.
It's a little bit rich coming from the most anti-Alberta government in Canadian history. We thought Trudeau 1 was bad, but under this Prime Minister, we've never seen such brazen attacks on the hardworking people from my province. The greatest province in this country, Alberta, has come from this Prime Minister. The attacks don't stop, whether it's on our province, on our energy sector, on our farmers, and everyday hardworking Canadians. I don't think there's any Canadian today that can trust this government that whatever they're doing is in the best interest of Canadians. And we recently saw that with the carbon tax scam, where the Environment Minister, who is probably one of the most anti-Alberta ministers that I've ever seen, hid a report that proved to Canadians that there's a $30 billion carbon tax loss to the economy, to workers. They did everything they could to hide that report. So I don't know anyone that can trust that this government is doing anything for the best interest for Canada or for Canadians.
For Saskatoon West.
Madam Speaker, my dear mother was recently going through some old papers and found a poem from the late 1970s she had saved all these years. In those days, we had Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. I was shocked at the similarities between then and now. Here's the poem. The Prime Minister is my shepherd, I shall not work. He maketh me to lie down on park benches. He leadeth me beside still factories. He restoreth my faith in the Conservatives. He guideth me in paths of unemployment. Yea, though I walk through the valley of soup kitchens, I shall still be hungry. For they are against me. They anointed my income with taxes. My expenses runneth over my salary. Surely poverty and hard living shall follow me all the days of this Liberal administration, and I shall live in a rented house forever. Madam Speaker, after 45 years, nothing has changed. His son, our current Prime Minister, has dragged Canada into an even worse mess than his father. Thankfully, it will be, once again, a new Conservative government to the rescue to fix everything the Liberals have broken. Let's bring it home.
L'honorable député d'Edmonton, Wetaskiwin.
Mr. Speaker, the disastrous Trudeau economic legacy, 14 deficits in 15 years in the 70s and 80s, led to untold devastation for Canadian families and massive cuts to Canadian healthcare spending and critical federal programs for seniors and families. After 8 more long years, that family legacy has now resulted in 20 consecutive deficit budgets under Prime Minister Trudeau and his son. That family legacy is definitely not worth the cost. Some are now saying that we will spend more on interest payments this year than we do on the Canada Health transfer. Is that true?
L'honorable ministre.
Speaker, maybe the honourable member from the south of Edmonton forgot or had amnesia over the 10 dark years under the Harper government, and quite frankly, he is one of the silent Conservative voices, 30 silent Conservative voices, MPs all from Alberta, Mr. Speaker, saying nothing about Danielle Smith's reckless and irresponsible attempt to take Albertans out of the CPP. Is he happy to scare seniors in his riding? Is he happy to destabilize CPP for the country, Mr. Speaker? Shame on him and his whole party for being silent and scaring Alberta and Canadian seniors.
L'honorable député d'Edmonton-Wetaskiwin.
Mr. Speaker, when each faced a global crisis, our governments definitely took distinctly different routes. Our Conservative government ran targeted, time-limited deficits and laid out a timeline to get back to balance by 2015, which we did. This Liberal Prime Minister, on the other hand, announced that the crisis was an opportunity to reimagine our economy and embarked on a wild-eyed experiment that has our country teetering on the edge of financial devastation. My question again, will this government spend more this year on interest than we do on the Canada Health transfer? Yes or no?
L'honorable ministre.
Speaker, and the honourable member across is really good at cherry-picking facts. I can tell you conversations that I had with Conservative members of Parliament during the middle of the pandemic. You know what they said, Mr. Speaker? They said, forget the loan programs, forget the ability to help people to actually pay their rent. You know what they said, Mr. Speaker? They said, let the market decide. What did they want to have? Breadlines and poverty and decimation in our streets. Shame on them for scaring people about CPP, and shame on them for revisionist history. This is a government that supports Canadians and has lifted over 1 million people out of poverty. Shame on them.
Disgrace, Randy. You really are.
So it's a choice between a country where people who work hard can make their dreams come true, or a country where a government splits people, divides them between good and bad. A government that gets involved in everything but doesn't get good at anything.
Smarts, not based on entitlement or inheritance. Speaking of inheritance, no, I'm not talking about Justin Trudeau's family fortune, which he hid out in a tax-protected trust fund. I'm talking about the country that he inherited. Did any Prime Minister ever inherit a richer legacy? Did any Prime Minister ever squander it so thoroughly? Think back to how we lived when Justin Trudeau was elected. No, really, think. Interest rates and inflation were rock bottom. Taxes were falling faster than at any time in Canadian history. The New York Times had calculated that Canada's middle class, for the first time ever, was richer than America's middle class. Thank you, Stephen Harper. The budget was balanced. Thank you again, Stephen Harper. Crime had fallen by 25%, so low that small-town folks often left their doors unlocked. Our borders were secure. Housing costs were half of what they are today. Take-home pay had jumped 10% after tax and inflation. All this despite a once-in-a-lifetime financial crisis in the U.S., and wars in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and yes, Ukraine. Funny how when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, none of those wars caused inflation in Canada, right? Yes, when Justin Trudeau took over, Canada was rich, affordable, and safe. And he promised that if he had a big government that took more power and more money, he would change everything. And boy, did he ever. That is the only promise that he kept. So what has changed? What has changed? 8 years later, inflation, after already hitting a 40-year high, is back on the rise again. And the economy is shrinking. GDP per capita is actually smaller today than it was 6 years ago, and Canada's growth is now projected to be the worst in the entire OECD, not just for the next 6 years, but for the next 3 decades. Housing costs have more than doubled after Trudeau promised to lower them. It takes 25 years now in Toronto to save up for a down payment. Do you remember when you used to pay off the entire mortgage in 25 years? Some families have to stretch their mortgage out 90 years now, which means that they will have to live to be 120 to ever be mortgage free. Under Trudeau, Canadian homes cost over 50% more than U.S. homes, and you can now buy a castle in Sweden for a lower price than a two-bedroom in Kitchener. It's almost incredible to say these things, isn't it? But this is life after 8 years of Trudeau. Toronto is now ranked the world's worst housing bubble, and Vancouver is the third most unaffordable housing market in the world. Worse than New York City, worse than London, England, worse than Singapore, a tiny island with 2,000 times more people per square kilometre than Canada. Meanwhile, Trudeau's carbon tax has forced 1.5 million people to food banks, and it caused a fifth of all people to skip meals.